Thanks everybody who's joining us here in the group. I'm Lee Hauer. I'm one of the co-founders and partners at NextView. And for those of you who may have joined us for one of the prior ones we've done, this is basically an informal chat that we do, not quite every week, but every couple of weeks we do one. And the idea for us is, just to open the kimono a little bit with, the rest of the startup ecosystem on kind of what's on the minds of an early stage VC firm. And we also try to have a guest each week. And so we've got Mark Chou here with us today. And, I know Melody, you and Mark have known each other for a while, so you'll kind of tee up.
10 years, has at least 10 years, right? Something like that.
It's been about 10 years. So.
Yeah.
And Mark was one of the first 3 or 4 employees at Away and exec there, and angel investor and advisor in a variety of other companies. So he could talk about a lot of different experiences. But before we get to that, we have no particular ground rules here. It's an informal chat about what's happening in startup VC world, but also what's happening in the real world too. We keep it pretty casual. If there are questions or things that folks want to touch on, please feel free to use the chat function in Zoom, and we'll try to touch on stuff that people have interest in. But other than that, we're basically kick it off. So I'm trying to think of some of the new things going on.
What are we talking about today, Lee?
So I'm trying to think of some of the new things that have been going on in the world that have been on people's top of mind. The one fun thing that came up was, Nicole, you brought it to my attention. There's been a trend in recent years of folks in the sports and entertainment and other world starting VC funds, but the latest is this band Chainsmokers, which you may know, come out with a variety of different extremely popular songs in the last few years. They have evidently started, or they plan to invest a $50 million fund in startups, which was interesting.
Yeah, they've already started investing.
Oh, how many investments did they say they had?
Two, I think, yeah. So, maybe one day we'll see ourselves co-investing with the Chainsmokers.
I think it's great, right? It's like, what's a VC's job? It's like you have to fundraise, and so they ostensibly have access to capital from maybe folks within the industry, some of their peers. You want to attract entrepreneurs, and so perhaps they have, especially something that's music related, have the ability to attract unique opportunities that way, and then they can help their portfolio companies by some of their notoriety. So
one of the things,
I think the sports and music VCs, it's a good side gig for them.
They're not just investing in music stuff. That says their first investment was in LoanSnap, a mortgage lending startup.
Mm.
So I find that interesting that they're heading into mortgage lending, being DJs.
Yep. Another headline that caught my attention this week, obviously, and a lot of people who are especially in this industry have been paying close attention to it, has been, Uber's potential buy of Grubhub. It makes total sense from the standpoint of, there's a variety of players in this marketplace, and consolidation is a likely thing to happen, given there's only so many platforms that can proliferate for food delivery, and frankly, it's been this interesting ecosystem where these platforms have taken off and are used by millions and millions of people, myself included, but it's been not a highly profitable enterprise for the platforms, given the way that economics work, but also not there have been points where restaurants have been frustrated with their experience in generating demand through the platforms too. So if Uber takes out Grubhub and they consolidate, there's still obviously DoorDash and Postmates and a whole variety of other different groups, as well as others that are more local or regional. But it'll be interesting to see how the dynamics of it play out in terms of the profitability of those platforms.
It'd be interesting to see what the government does when it comes to antitrust. You can see a somewhat analogous example of cable players consolidating, and you said you have to look at concentration market by market, and they might or might not have to be forced to divest in the areas where they have more than, whatever the threshold is, 50% market share or whatnot. But then what's the point of doing the acquisition or the merger? And the other thing, yeah.
It'll be interesting though, this is true for all kinds of antitrust stuff where how you define market share, how narrowly or broadly you define market share impacts whether it appears to be concentrated or not, right? So if you say, what percentage of all restaurants in this metro market do delivery, and what percent of those are on either Grubhub or Uber, there's lots and lots of restaurants that do offer, delivery without going through a software, platform like that, versus strictly benchmarking. Okay, Yelp, DoorDash, Postmates, the other ones. What's the software, marketplace market share?
It's like the classic Google is like, well, we're only a tiny percentage of the overall global advertising market, so don't worry about us, versus they're like 80% of, 50% of the online advertising.
98% of the search market, whatever, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Pay attention to that.
Yeah.
Another thing that I was paying attention to this week, one of the portfolio CEOs that we work with, who's based in New York, and has been building their company in New York for some time, has lived in New York and has built more than one company in New York before. Mentioned something on Twitter about the possibility of leaving the city and moving to a more remote place. I'm curious how others are thinking about or seeing, changes that may or may not occur in terms of both, not just work from home, but, obviously Twitter announced work from home permanently this week and what have you, but, people building startups, especially, like, how they're going to think about being in an urban area or not being in an urban area in the future.
Mark, what do you guys think? You're going to hunker down New York City? Are you?
Yeah, I mean, well, we are planning to head up to the Hudson Valley in early June, just to get a little bit of a change of scenery, get a little bit more fresh air. As you know, with a 21-month-old and their hands always being everywhere, like being out on the streets of New York is just not really a fun proposition. So being, out in a field, I think would be nice. Yeah, it's kind of funny. I grew up in the suburbs outside of Birmingham, Alabama. My wife is Hong Kong born and raised, and then came to the States to attend NYU. And so she's only ever been in the city. And, for me, I've always there has always been a little bit of an attraction for me for the suburbs that feels Stepford Wives-ish to my wife. But I think that this time is, creating some new conversations for us, particularly as I'm now, working for myself, and given that I'm launching my new firm in this new environment where, all business development, all work has to be done remote anyways. In some ways, it's kind of an interesting precedent, I guess, that I'm setting for myself in terms of, not necessarily benefiting that much right now from actually being local to New York. I do think that one of the interesting things about, the current environment also is that I feel like in terms of the, companies, human capital sort of challenge, which has always been, I think a problem where they're trying to optimize towards a local max of, call it a 25 or 50 mile radius of HQ, I think is now becoming one where, in this new world, like, as long as, the working hours are not like so incompatible where, one party is sleeping when the other one's awake, it, at least for the US, right, I think kind of opens up the entire country for people who are actually looking for talent. And in that way, I think, the sort of benefits of being in a big city and kind of those associated network effects start to go away. And so, yeah, I think that there will be a increasing openness, I think, to hiring folks who are not, who won't necessarily be co-located with folks at HQ. At the same time, like, is this like the future of all work? And, you know, are we never going to go back to the office again? And, you know, like, Vornado is just done for? Like, I don't think it's going to be quite that either. And I do think that, you know, thinking about some of the early kind of days at Away, I think that being in the same office together, there was something about that did benefit efficiency in getting things done. And yeah, I don't know. I feel like there's definitely going to be pros and cons, but one thing I can say for sure is that trying to work, with, you know, aforementioned 21-month-old just running around is not the easiest. So,
yeah, I think, you know, my suspicion is that, you know, remote and distributed work will be more part of a fabric for the knowledge economy. At least, obviously, there's not every industry and not every job can be done remotely, but you know, for the kinds of tech startups that we work with, you know, distributed teams, remote work is just going to be more pervasive on a go forward basis. That being said, I'd be surprised if, you know, work from home, work purely remote, purely distributed will persist forever. You know, human beings are social creatures, and as a professional team, you know, I do think, I mean, I've been part of startups before getting on the VC side, and there is something to having, you know, 4 or 5 people around a whiteboard in the flesh, you know, brainstorming an idea and trying to solve a problem or whatever, which, you know, as much as you try with, you know, the tools that we have today, which are far better than what existed even just a decade or two ago, it's still not quite the same. And in terms of the creativity and the productivity and the human connection. So
I would say, I mean, I miss being in the office, right? It's, forget like productivity or not productive, like just like mental well-being. I think it's nice to go someplace else that's a physical space that is different from your home life, that you can just, you know, turn on your work brain and then have some, you know, social interaction with your coworker peers as well. So
right. And create distance between your, you know, both physical and, you know, mental and emotional distance between your work and your home. Yeah. Where right now the lines are blurred. It's interesting though, you know, one of the companies that we work with, portfolio companies, I was talking to the CEO on Tuesday. There's a company headquartered in San Francisco that employs hundreds of people in their headquarters, and they've got people elsewhere too. You know, they're in the process of moving to a new facility when all this happened, and they're now going to reconfigure the new building that they were going to move into. But it'll look like what they expect the new building is going to end up looking like is essentially a dedicated WeWork, right? So it's going to be like a hot desk, you know, conference room, Zoom room type environment, not you know, people have a dedicated workstation. And, you know, their expectation, at least for the next year or two, might be that, you know, no one has a fixed workstation. People work from home some of the times, but then they come to the office some of the times and use conference rooms and hot desk and what have you. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out.
Yeah, that's my bet. It's not going to be, I think pre-COVID, there are 2 types of companies, which is a majority, 95%, at least in tech, like we're an HQ company and maybe we have some remote teams, but we're not an all remote culture. And then there's 5% that are like, we were remote from day one, and that's just how we build a culture. And I think my belief, at least pre-COVID, is that it's really hard to build that unless you start from the very early on. But I feel like going forward, it's going to be like on a spectrum where every company is going to have a gradient of percentage of people who come in 50% of the time or 30% of the time. Because I think, you know, Leah, you mentioned like brainstorming, the spontaneous way of like communicating and coming up with ideas is still really, really hard to do in this format. At least we don't have the tools. And I don't even know if it's a product challenge or that's like that's an insurmountable thing for us to overcome. But I think that's probably, and then so as a result, I do think that the talent concentration in urban areas and markets still has its benefit, because there's still going to be a percentage of people who are going to convene. Maybe it is a slightly more coordinated, intentional basis, as opposed to Monday through Friday, everybody just shows up.
There's literally eons of human evolution built around people interacting face to face. I'm pretty sure that, one pandemic and a few months of Zoom usage is not going to overturn some of those natural instincts. So we had one question here, which why don't we touch on this, and then maybe after that we shift a little bit to, Melody and Mark, you guys being able to chat a little bit about some of the away experience. But so the question was around, given that one of the areas that we at NextView invest in, and Broadhurst as well, Mark's new platform, is in sort of consumer-facing products and CPG products. The question was around what are some of the consumer trends that we're seeing during COVID that we think are going to persist even after, some of the lockdowns start to be lifted, or even after, people stop, the pandemic at some point will stop being the thing which is front and center in all of our lives. It might be a while, but at some point that'll happen. So, I'll start just some of the consumer-facing companies and consumer product companies that I've been working with. I do think that there's definitely a persistent trend or an accelerated trend of physical retail to e-commerce, right? So it doesn't, you pick any macroeconomic, forecaster, and they talk about, okay, e-commerce is a percent of consumer spend going from 10 or 15% to 20 or 30%, and that persisting. I think, so I think e-commerce penetration is not going to go backwards. People will go out and shop in physical retail for any variety of goods and services once, restrictions start to get lifted. But, I think we've run this giant experiment of, many people are trying to consume more things through an online remote ordering experience, and that's not going to go backwards as things change. In terms of like, where are people spending their time and money and energy? I do think that, a lot of the activities obviously around, non-discretionary spend right now, right? So, we've all seen people stock up at, whether they use a grocery delivery service or they go to a physical grocery store, groceries and paper towels and toilet paper and hand sanitizer and all that kind of stuff. But I do think, and then also, entertainment at home, kind of comfort, comfort products. I do think some of that will persist. And what I mean there is, this has been a time where everyone has been forced to stay at home and be with the people who are in their household a lot more. And for some people, when the opportunity to venture out in the world and interact with a broad array of people opens up, they're going to take advantage of that in spades. But for many people, they're sort of realizing, hey, there's aspects of staying at home and being with, the people in my household more that I like, and I'm going to keep doing that. And so I'm going to invest in, the quote unquote nesting, right? Whether it's, I'm going to have a nicer garden, or I'm going to fix something in my basement or whatever. I think that behavior, at least some of that's going to persist longer term. I don't know. What do you get?
What is a basement? I don't
What's
know.
that?
What is a garden and what is a basement?
Yeah, exactly. So I've already given away that I live in the burbs outside of Boston. Yeah, I live outside of Boston, but yeah, I'm a suburban dweller, not a dense urban dweller.
I add one thing, kind of related to what Lee just said. There's potentially an interesting. I think that given that everybody's forced to stay at home, I was talking to my coffee shop guy. Yes, I live in New York City, and I still go get coffee sometimes. Support local coffee shop that's still open. And he made a good point. He was like, the one of the silver linings of this whole thing is that you get to be more introspective, and you get to spend more time looking inward. You can describe it as self-care. You can describe it as like, self-investing or inward looking at introspectiveness. But I do think there potentially could be opportunities in and around that. Or it relates slightly adjacent to mental health, self-care, because when we're stuck at home, we're also potentially getting more stressed out. due to you got baby running around and you don't have childcare and you have both parents at work or whatnot. So that could potentially be something that persists even beyond the immediate COVID period.
And I think that on the physical health front as well, I do feel like, in a prior world, I think there were certain frictions associated with kind of changing behavior that were so different that meant that, most people would still kind of continue doing things in the way that they'd always done them without necessarily even considering very seriously other alternatives. And so I think, I'd never really thought about, telehealth options really, right? For me, like the medical experience is like very much like an in-person one. Like that's how I know like I'm getting like real value for my money per se, right? Because the doctor can like really see me. And I think now being in a situation where the frictions are great enough for that alternative that, I think people are going to be very open to telehealth, now. And once that there is a greater level of being accustomed to that, it's not that, in-person visits will go away. And of course, like procedures and whatever, cannot as of yet be done virtually, but, there will be, I think, a much greater openness to alternatives. And the other thing that actually comes to mind is another company I think that probably everyone here is familiar with, Capsule for delivery of pharmaceuticals. And, I have a Duane Reade that is a 30-second walk away from my apartment. And, it would never really be, prior to this point, it's never really occurred to me that I would really need another option besides that. And I think for a lot of people that I've spoken to as well, that's just enough of a like ingrained sort of behavior that the idea of actually telling your doctor to actually give your script to this other company that'll then send it, just maybe didn't resonate in the way that it definitely does now. And if the number of capsule ads that I'm seeing on Hulu now is any indication, I presume that they're definitely killing it right now in terms of that, driving demand and fulfilling through them rather than Duane Reade, CVS, Walgreens. So.
Yeah, it's interesting, especially telehealth in particular, where, I suspect there was at least some consumer demand for whether it's a video consultation or, remote purchasing of pharmaceuticals or things like that before. But regardless of whatever consumer demand there was or wasn't, you also have sort of the provider ecosystem, the regulatory ecosystem in terms of their openness to it. And, this has been a grand experiment for everybody on so many different dimensions, whether you're talking about people staying at home or, educating and schooling kids from home or telehealth, where, physicians and other healthcare providers have been forced to figure out how to make, remote consultation work. And regulators have eased the, ease the regulatory environment for it to be possible. So it's interesting that it's not just the consumer behaviors that have been changed, but there have been enforced changes for, sort of the supply side and the regulatory side.
So Mark, want to switch gears a little bit back to Away. So maybe help orient everybody here. Can you talk about, paint a picture for us? How was Away like when you joined? You were there for a number of years through kind of their hyper growth era, which I know was a lot of work and a lot of fun at the same time. Maybe just help us, guide us a little bit, like what kind of stuff were you doing? You held a few different roles. Early days, I remember the kind of VP of growth, and then you actually own product a little bit as well. And then you went on to lead international, and also for a period of time, you're GM of China. But maybe just help us understand, how was it like in the early days, and what different pockets of the organization did you get to touch and help build?
Yeah, I think what's exciting about the earliest days at Away, and I joined basically a month after we launched. So I was the third employee hired. It was a literal handful of people. in a small office in Little Italy. And yeah, I think I really thought it was a blast. And that is a large part of why, after 4 years there, I did decide to leave and to start my own thing, to focus more on the early stage. But, at the very beginning, my remit was essentially, very broadly speaking, marketing and then digital. So at that time, essentially all aspects of both brand and growth marketing, so to speak, rolled up into me, and the product function, as you mentioned, Melody, rolled up into me as well. Working with our outsourced engineering team, and that was very much the focus for, call it, the first year or so was those areas specifically. And yeah, essentially growing, the entire sort of strategy, the execution in terms of, onboarding marketing agencies, finding, the right marketing technology. And at the end of the day, like actually doing a lot of the work myself really was, we didn't hire kind of our first people under me until 6 months in, around the time when we raised our Series A in late 2016. And so during that period of time, it was very much, I think, trying to do like everything from top to bottom. And when I came on board at Away, and was chatting with Steph actually and Jen prior to joining, I think they wanted to make it clear, we were not looking to necessarily hire a senior person at this stage of the company. And when we say that, you're ahead of this or that, just to make sure that we're on the same page, just know that when you say you're ahead of, you're also going to be doing all this stuff yourself for an indeterminate period of time. Like, are you okay with that? And I think given that that's sort of the environment that I had been coming out from at the role prior to Away, I think that was, great for me. And I think I really enjoyed that. But also the process of, I think, building a team, like developing talent, is also something that I was, very excited about, and have had the opportunity to essentially do that for, probably around a total of 40 people across all of my different departments over the course of 4 years at Away. Over time, I think as the kind of company need arose, I was tapped to take on sort of new functions and to build and hire and develop those as well. So data analytics was one that we invested in pretty early on. Customer insights, after that, we also started building out. I think at the end of the day, when you look at the sort of combination of the different functions that I oversaw, it really was, what you could say very much the demand generation part of the organization. So, everything from, the brand and growth marketing aspects, and, the insights and data that are driving a lot of that decision-making and product development, to, the actual, website, experience and the delivery of, the shopping experience to the end customers. So, that I think was a really great, experience over the course of, 2.5, 3 years. And in late 2018, and at this point in time, we had, grown to be a Series C company. I went out on paternity leave in August of that year. And, when coming back from that a couple months later, our CEO, Steph, basically said, like, hey, you set your team up well, you had all the right processes in place, trained your people well. I don't know that you need to actually really continue being in the day-to-day weeds of managing your team. So how about China? And so that's when I first started exploring, what it might look like for us to expand into China, which we're, still doing now. But fast forward a couple months later, I was tapped in early 2019 to lead all of our international markets. So that includes the UK, continental Europe, Australia, and Canada. along with kind of continued exploration into what, a greater China strategy might look like. So I think that was a really great experience, essentially the first kind of general management role created at Away besides Steph's, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, it was definitely, I think, very eye-opening in terms of needing to expand beyond just these areas of the business that I was very familiar with before, and having to understand, all of the, accounting and supply chain and logistics and, tax and legal ramifications of actually operating in these countries, I think was definitely, quite the boot camp for sure. And it really is a tribute to a lot of the, cross-functional partners, that we had,
Mm-hmm.
For the success that we were able to see. But yeah, I think it was, around this time when, over the course of, leading international and really seeing kind of the expansion of the company and, employee kind of count, doubling from like the beginning of 2019 to the end, that this realization about the increasing size of the company and just, sort of the nature of things just being different from when I joined, right? Really started to be something that I started to be able to kind of articulate better in my own mind. And yeah, which is what ultimately led me to let Steph know, towards the end of 2019 that I wanted to kind of strike it out on my own and, if not like do this exact same thing again, but, rather still focus a little bit more on the early stages of growth. And so, yeah, kind of bring us to today and, kind of continuing to do that consulting, advising, investing.
Yeah. Yeah. And so when you think about maybe the first 12 to 18 months of your time at Away, I'm going to call them that the early days. What do you think that you guys / the company did well? What were the key strategic decisions that you felt like helped the growth and the setup of the company? That could be, on the marketing side, that could be people, hiring decisions. I'm just curious, like, can you identify a few things that you feel like were key strategic decisions that were made right?
Yeah, so I think one of the most important ones from my perspective actually, preceded my even coming on board. And I think that was the decision for Jen and Steph to work with each other as co-founders. And I think when I talk about that, I think I'm really talking about that sort of left and right brain balance and having, both of these perspectives at the highest levels of decision-making power within the company, in a way where they are a push-pull against each other. And I think that healthy tension through everything that came afterwards, resulted in, I think, better decision-making as a result of this person not being able to basically just plow ahead without, someone else with like a different perspective and a different type of leaning to be able to sort of push up against your natural tendencies, right? And I think we did see that continue to flow through, the organization and, like talking about, brand and performance marketing or growth marketing, right? And, how those are, often at odds. And, I think we've very much always, approached those two as being kind of both very complementary and necessary kind of aspects of marketing, and how, the two of them together, so to speak, are stronger than their sum of their parts, greater than the sum of their parts. I think that, that brand and growth bit also is something that we did do a good job in. I think, 5 or so years ago, the startup world was in, this heyday of performance marketing. There's a lot of arbitrage opportunities everywhere. It's kind of the Wild West. I think people were figuring all this stuff out that was able to scale companies quickly. And a lot of these folks, I think, were being held up as, these marketing geniuses and, PR and brand people. And to some degree, I think were written off. And then I think fast forward, to the conversation, which started in 2018 and really accelerated into 2019 and today, in terms of kind of the CAC is the new rent mantra, right? And, with CPMs increasing and, a souring of attitudes towards performance marketing. And all of a sudden it's the cool thing to talk about how you have a marketing budget of 0 and all of your customer acquisition is organic and all of your budget is really plowed into, PR and influencers and, experiential and those sorts of things. And I don't know, like there's a little bit of a false dichotomy there, right? And it's not, I think, Melody, you've written about this very topic before, I think, for the NextView. And, these different channels, these different, places where you touch the consumer online and offline, like they all play together. And I think we very much approach things, I think, holistically from the very beginning. And I think that's, another aspect of our approach, to sort of executing, I think that really paid dividends. The last thing would be to actually mention just one sort of thing that Steph and I actually talked about in our very first coffee chat ever, actually. What was supposed to be a half-hour sort of conversation turned into 2.5 hours. And one of the things that we talked about was this sort of idea of, strong opinions held loosely. And I think that, for both of us, this idea of, kind of coming to the table with a point of view and, conviction about something, I think is important when you're, hired to have a point of view about something, right? But then also simultaneously being in a place where you are open to seeing what the data is telling you, right? That even if you had a hypothesis, that there's the possibility that it could be overturned, right? And that your original hunch, your original conviction could be wrong, I think was another thing that was very much a sort of overarching principle of the way that we tested and learned at Away in the early days. So I'll kind of leave it at those 3 things.
What was it like? I mean, when you guys were growing in the most rapid growth phase there, you were competing both against the traditional incumbents in the category, as well as, there were multiple, VC backed, direct to consumer, luggage brands too. So I'm curious, how did you guys think about the competitive landscape, during that, sort of middle phase of really rapid growth of, we're competing against, the other, because we're competing in these performance marketing channels and subway ads and everything else, like we're competing against, the VC backed, DTC competitors, or we're competing against the traditional folks, or we're competing against non-consumption, or I'm just curious how you thought about that.
Yeah. So I think, the non-consumption point that I actually brought up at the very end was, I think, an interesting one, because I know it's not the answer that people were often looking for when asking me like what I thought our competitors were, but I would always say, like, I think it's really that like piece of crap suitcase like in your closet that's like halfway broken but not completely broken yet. Like that's our biggest competitor, right? And I think that that sort of dovetails into one of the things that I think we were able to do as a company in terms of changing the consumer's perspective of what luggage is as a category, right? Is shifting it from a purely utilitarian kind of object, right, to one that more similar to the like the fashion and apparel world, right, really actually becomes like a representation of who you are, right, and your luggage actually saying something about you. I do think that Ribova, to their credit, and I'm very much a sort of heritage brands guy myself, which may sound ironic given where my career has been, particularly recently, but I think they have done a really great job of making their product an aspirational one, of making it an emotional one, where like you see the stickers of all the locations and the hotels that you've been, right, and that being kind of a your suitcase itself really is kind of that aggregate souvenir of all the places you've ever been. But they are admittedly, I think, at a significantly higher price point. And I think for most of the rest of the category, it was very much, I think, a functionally oriented one. And I think what we were able to do is to make it a more emotional experience and an emotional object. And, if you're to look at things like very cynically, like what is luggage? It's a box on 2 or 4 wheels with a handle with, a zipper and or, buttons. What distinguishes one from the other functionally? Like not that much. I do think that with, the product development team and the customer insights team that we have, like there really is like a lot of, really great small details, that are very thoughtful. But, once again, taking the cynics view, like you could argue also that there's not that much different. And the way that we were able to kind of connect the consumer, like, and in a way that they found compelling, I think was something that was quite different.
Yeah. Without getting,
So,
sorry,
go ahead, Nick.
I was gonna say, without getting into Away's business per se, or predictions, Away's views of the future, I'm curious what your take will be on, and Away's business is really as a product business, not as a services business, but, the travel industry is obviously going through a period where there's a lot of, there's a lot of uncertainty about basically as every aspect of all of our lives, but, the travel industry, there's uncertainty in terms of, how people's behaviors will change. And I don't mean just the sort of next week or next month. I'm talking about, sort of in the longer run future. Do you have any thoughts, on as a interested student of the travel industry? Again, not talking about Away's business specifically, but just what do you think trends will be or consumer shifts might happen in the coming years, and how people travel and where they travel or how they travel?
Yeah, I think the first thing I would say is that, I feel like, already given some of what I've been seeing happen, like I will definitely not claim to be, a great prognosticator on this front. I just saw, I think not too long ago, that like cruise bookings are like shooting like way up now. And I would have been the last person to expect that to really be the case. So, all bets are out. But I do think that ultimately, and even kind of going back to like the very, first like minute of our conversation or whatever, and the fact that, I'm planning to head, upstate, in a few weeks, I think we really need that. I think, there is something particularly given like how, confined that we have been, where I think a change of scenery is really great. Right. And I think that sort of very sort of human desire will not go away. But the ways in which I think people travel and the extent, to which they're, traveling like abroad versus a couple hours away, I think, that could change, but, I think it'll be, interesting to see how that all works out. I think that one interesting thing that could be happening, right? So if we look back to the aftermath of 9/11, right? A lot of travel, particularly air travel, I think changed significantly in terms of the process, right? There was a lot more friction added to the process, and that was something that people had to get used to. I think going forward, the idea of, walking through some sort of scanner, or metal detector, and followed by some sort of like UV booth, right? Like could be something new, like the extent to which people will need to be, tested, disinfected, like all these things to ensure that like you don't have this thing that people don't want, right? In the same way that, we were concerned about, weapons or explosives, right? Following 9/11, I think how that will manifest and the amount of like extra time that will be involved in travel of all sorts, I think will be, I think a major factor in, the extent to which, like different modes of travel are ones that people are comfortable with, either from the perspective of how safe they feel or how comfortable are they with the very extensive and burdensome measures that need to be taken to ensure their safety.
Right. I mean, it is true it took a little while for airline travel to rebound after 9/11, but like it's actually kind of remarkable how quickly people just got accustomed to heightened security screening and, you know, all that kind of stuff. It's like, it's just, people got accustomed to it, and that's what you do, right? And we complain about TSA lines and all that other stuff, but like, you know, it's amazing how humans adapt.
Yeah.
I know, what will be the TSA pre-check equivalent of our post-COVID world travel?
Well, there's probably like a clear like service if you,
Yeah,
you
exactly.
have some kind of immunity from antibodies or something like that, perhaps.
So Mark, last question for you. You've been doing a little bit of angel investing. Can you talk a bit about what types of stuff are you looking for? What gets you excited? And, you know, especially I'm imagining this, you're drawing a fair bit from your prior experience, most significantly from Away. But yeah, just maybe share a little bit about like how you think about these opportunities and these super early stage companies.
Yeah, so I think on, you know, so from, you know, on my end, you know, both brands and I think, you know, the picks and shovels companies supporting them. So kind of throughout the, you know, the commerce stack, I think are companies that, you know, I'm looking at for investing, but, you know, just focusing on kind of the brands specifically for now. I think that, you know, the first thing, which in some ways, like perhaps you could call obvious, but, you know, maybe isn't, is that, yeah, you have a compelling consumer product that's, you know, solving a significant problem. And I think the sort of significant problem end of things, I think, is the one that is interesting because, you know, looking at how D2C the world has become, I think not every category is, you know, so broken, in my opinion, that, you know, yet another offering necessarily makes sense. And so I think just thinking long and hard about, you know, that and what your sort of like market opportunity is a pretty kind of important part of that. And, you know, to some extent, like if your market size ultimately is not necessarily that big, you know, I think perhaps it could still make sense to raise money, but, you know, the amount of money that you're going to raise, you know, should hopefully reflect, you know, ultimately what this kind of company at scale might look like. Otherwise, I think there's just going to be a mismatch in terms of ultimately like what people are going to want you to exit at, you know, versus kind of the amount of capital that's been raised. I think the second is around, I think it's really kind of really boils down to execution, and specifically, I think also, you know, for early stage companies, the founder or co-founders level of self-awareness of what they're good at and what they're not good at. Are they filling in their own gaps of knowledge with, you know, advisors, with, you know, early angels, with early team members, and, you know, do they have a sense of, yeah, like this awareness that, hey, like there are certain things that maybe they're not going to be super great at, and that demonstrating, you know, hopefully like a willingness to actually like plug those holes as well. Yeah, without that, I feel like it's you know, you run into the problem where, yeah, if you have a Jen without a Steph or Steph without a Jen, right? I think that the company that results from that is not going to be as strong. I think the last bit is thinking about building a brand and not just a product company. I think that, you know, this is not like a you know, wholesale knock, but, you know, for a lot of Kickstarter, not all, but a lot of Kickstarter companies, they're very much kind of focused on like, hey, like here's our like really cool product, and, you know, it's a travel hoodie that has 25 features, right? And I don't know, that
doesn't exist, by the way.
No, exactly, yeah. And I think because of that approach and that very feature-focused approach, and, you know, compared to some of the other, you know, Lee, you mentioned some of the other kind of VC-backed players who are kind of also popping up at around the same time, I think, you know, a brand-oriented approach versus a feature-focused approach, I think, played out, you know, ultimately with certain businesses kind of going out of business, and then other ones succeeding. And I think that that's a pretty important one to think about, particularly in the consumer space, right, which I think is commoditized. And if we're talking about once again, like the cynical view of a suitcases as like a box, right, or the cynical view of mattresses, or whatever you want to whatever category you want to pick, trying to differentiate yourself just on the basis of feature set and expecting that to be a long-term competitive moat and something that will somehow still kind of drive, customer retention and loyalty. Like, I feel like that's an unrealistic expectation. So I think an awareness of that and a focus on building a brand, I think is important. But on the other hand, yeah, if you're just looking to have a lifestyle business that is kind of product oriented, I think that's great and fine as well. Not everyone needs to raise venture. But I think those people also need to kind of realize, like, yeah, maybe they need to think about, what their capital structure should look like.
Great. Well, thanks for joining us, Mark.
Yeah,
This was fun.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks for coming.
Yeah, and thanks everybody for coming and asking questions. And like Lee said, we do these somewhat regularly, so probably on a bi-weekly basis. So be on the lookout, our email list or Twitter, LinkedIn, for the next one.
Great. Thanks all. Bye. Enjoy the rest of your day.